The werewolf girl Barista keeps giving me free drinks. Have you ever wondered why an apex predator capable of tearing through reinforced steel with her bare claws would tremble at the sound of a human ordering a darkly roasted coffee? It creates a fascinating paradox when you witness Laura, who is a lycanthrope of the royal bloodline working incognito, as a barista completely lose her composure simply because a man named Jack asks for his usual order with a bit of gravel in his throat. The most dangerous creature in the sector is not the one with the fangs, but the one who can tame the beast with nothing more than a low murmur and a polite request for oat milk. It begs the question of whether true power is physical dominance or the ability to soothe a savage soul with a single sentence. The Earth District brew hub on the planet Ethelgard sat like a warm ember in the middle of a city built from cold chrome and indifference. While the rest of the district chased the efficiency of nutrient pastes and direct neural injections for sustenance, the brew hub remained a bastion of the old ways where liquid was heated by coils and beans were ground by friction. It was a place that smelled of roasted earth and vanilla, which was a stark contrast to the sterile metallic scent that permeated the rest of the space station's docking ring. For Laura, standing behind the counter with her apron tied tight around her waist, this shop was more than a place of employment, it was a hiding spot. Her light brown fluffy ears were usually pressed flat against her skull in an attempt to blend in with the eclectic hairstyles of the spacer crowd, but they would always perk up involuntarily at 800 hours. That was when the door chimed. Jack did not look like a man who could command the attention of a royal beast. He wore a jacket that had seen better decades made of a synthetic leather that was peeling at the elbows, and his pockets were always weighed down by physical notebooks rather than digital datapads. He was a writer in a galaxy that had largely stopped reading in favor of direct sensory downloads, yet he persisted in the archaic art of putting ink to paper. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait that suggested he was never in a hurry, or perhaps that he was simply observing the world at a frame rate higher than everyone else. When he stepped up to the counter, the holographic menu screens flickered with the blue light of the morning specials, but he never looked at them. He only looked at Laura. "Good morning," Laura Jack said, and the sound was like a heavy stone dropping into a deep well. Laura felt the vibration of his voice travel through the countertop and up her arms. Her species, the canid hominids of the Valdris system, were evolved for hunting in dense forests, where sound was the primary navigational tool. Her hearing was sensitive enough to detect a heartbeat from 3 blocks away, which usually made living in a bustling city like Ethelgard a torturous experience of constant cacophony. The screech of maglev trains and the whine of atmospheric regulators were a constant assault on her senses. But Jack's voice was different. It sat in a lower register that seemed to bypass her auditory processing centers and resonate directly with her parasympathetic nervous system. It was a frequency of absolute calm. "Good morning, Jack," she stammered, and her hands shook slightly as she reached for a ceramic mug. The heat rising from her cheeks was not from the espresso machine. She kept her eyes focused on the task at hand, because looking him in the eye usually resulted in her tail betraying her by thumping a chaotic rhythm against the metal cabinets behind her. Jack leaned his elbows on the counter and watched her work. He was not oblivious, but he was patient. He had noticed weeks ago that the coffee he received was never the standard drip he paid for, but a high-grade export blend usually reserved for diplomats. He had also noticed that she never charged him for the upgrade. He watched the way her claws, which were currently retracted to look like manicured fingernails, tapped nervously against the saucer. He found the rhythm soothing. To him, she was not a monster or a predator. She was simply the most interesting person on a planet full of dull archetypes. "You look tired," Jack noted, his voice dropping another octave as he leaned in closer. The ambient noise of the cafe seemed to fade away when he spoke, leaving only the rich baritone that made Laura's knees feel like water. "It was a long night," Laura admitted, risking a glance upward. Her soft, warm eyes met his, and for a second the predator inside her, which was always packing and snarling at the edges of her consciousness, laid down and went asleep. The ventilation systems were acting up in my building. Too much noise. Jack nodded slowly as if this information was of vital strategic importance. Noise is the enemy of peace. You need silence to think, and you need silence to dream. I can bring you some noise-canceling foam from the surplus market if you like. It is not much, but it helps dampen the vibrations. Laura felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leap over the counter and tackle him, not to hurt him, but to simply wrap herself in that voice and stay there until the galaxy stopped spinning. Instead, she slid the mug across the counter with two hands. "It is on the house," she whispered. "I made too much." It was the same lie she told every day. Jack knew it was a lie. He knew that she made a fresh pot specifically for him the moment she saw him turn the corner onto the street. He smiled, a slow expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and took the mug. His fingers brushed against hers, and the static electricity that jumped between them was strong enough to make the holographic menu glitch for a second. "Thank you, Laura," Jack said. He did not move away immediately. He took a sip of the coffee and let out a contented sigh. "You have a gift, you know. This is the only thing on this planet that tastes real." Before Laura could respond or find a way to stop blushing, the atmosphere of the cafe shifted violently. The bell above the door did not chime so much as it screamed in protest as it was shoved open. Three large figures stomped in, bringing with them the smell of ozone and burnt engine grease. They were Krell mercenaries, large reptilian bipeds, with scales the color of bruised iron and attitudes to match. They were loud. They spoke in harsh, guttural barks that grated against the air like sandpaper on glass. Laura's ears flattened instantly. The influx of aggressive noise hit her like a physical blow. The Krell were known for their lack of manners and their tendency to break things that did not belong to them. They pushed their way to the front of the line, shoving a smaller avian customer out of the way with a casual cruelty that made Jack's jaw tighten. "Give us 3 stim packs, and make them hot," the largest Krell barked, slamming a fist onto the counter. The impact caused the delicate ceramic cups on the display shelf to rattle. Laura took a breath, trying to center herself. Her biology was screaming at her to engage. Her instincts, which she suppressed with medication and sheer willpower, were identifying the threat and calculating the most efficient way to sever the Krell's jugular. She could see the pulse throbbing in his neck. It would be so easy. One swipe. But she was Laura the barista. She was not Laura the exile. She was not a killer, not anymore. "I will be with you in a moment, gentlemen," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, but the growl was there, buried deep in the timbre. "Please do not hit the counter." The Krell laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. He leaned over the counter, invading her space. His yellow eyes narrowed as he looked at her. "You are a fuzzy one, aren't you? Maybe you should move faster, or maybe I will reach back there and speed you up myself." The threat was explicit. The air in the cafe grew cold. Other customers looked down at their tables, terrified of drawing attention. On Ethelgard, the law enforcement droids were slow to respond to the lower districts, and everyone knew it. Laura's hand moved beneath the counter, reaching for the panic button, but her fingers curled into a claw instead. Her vision began to tint red. The noise of the Krell's breathing was amplified in her ears, drowning out everything else. She could feel the shift coming, the painful restructuring of bone and muscle that would unleash the wolf. If she turned now, she would lose everything. She would be hunted down. She would have to run again. But she could not let this disrespect stand. Then a notebook slapped onto the counter. It was not a loud slap, but it was firm. It was the sound of authority. The Krell leader blinked and looked down. Jack was standing next to him, calmly opening his notebook to a fresh page. He did not look up at the giant reptile. He simply uncapped a pen. "Excuse me," Jack said, and his voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension like a laser scalpel. "You are interrupting my research." The Krell turned his massive head slowly to look at the human. Jack was half his size and had no visible weapons. The absurdity of the interruption seemed to confuse the mercenary. You talking to me, little meat?" Jack finally looked up. His expression was one of mild annoyance, as if the Krell was a spelling error he was trying to correct. "I am talking to the source of the noise pollution that is currently ruining the ambient acoustic profile of this establishment. I am conducting a study on the correlation between cranial capacity and volume control in sentient species. You are providing excellent data for the lower end of the spectrum." The cafe went deadly silent. Laura stared at Jack, her claws freezing halfway to extension. He was insane. He was going to get killed. The Krell stared at Jack, his brain trying to process the insults wrapped in academic language. "Are you insulting me, human?" Jack sighed and closed his notebook. "I am observing you. There is a difference. Now you have two choices. You can continue to posture and threaten the staff, which will result in me filing a report with the docking authority regarding the violation of Code 77B concerning public disturbances by unlicensed contractors. Or you can wait your turn like a civilized sapient and lower your voice to a conversational decibel." The Krell snarled and reached for the blaster pistol strapped to his thigh. "I think I will just smash your head in instead." Jack did not flinch. He did not even blink. He simply held the Krell's gaze with a boredom that was more terrifying than aggression. "I wouldn't do that." "Why not?" the Krell sneered. "Because," Jack said, dropping his voice to that lethal resonant pitch that made Laura shiver even from 3 feet away, "your ship is the Red Vulture parked in Bay 94, correct? I noticed the insignia on your shoulder. Standard mercenary transport. Likely running with expired intake valves to save credits. It would be a shame if the Port Authority decided to do a random safety audit while you were busy here. I have the inspector's direct frequency on my communicator. He owes me a favor." It was a bluff. Laura knew it was a bluff. Jack didn't know the port inspector. Jack wrote fiction for a living. But the Krell didn't know that. The Krell saw a human who was entirely too calm in the face of death and assumed that confidence was backed by power. The mercenary hesitated. He looked at his crew, who were looking back at him uncertainly. Mercenaries worked for profit, and getting their ship impounded was bad for business. The calculation was happening behind those yellow eyes. Was smashing this human worth the potential loss of their transport? The Krell grunted and took a step back, his hand moving away from his weapon. "You are lucky I am in a hurry, human." "We are all lucky," Jack said, turning back to his coffee, as if the Krell had already ceased to exist. The mercenaries grumbled, glared at Laura, and then turned and stomped out of the cafe, deciding that the coffee wasn't worth the hassle. The door swung shut, and the silence that followed was heavy. Laura let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Her legs felt weak. The red tint faded from her vision, replaced by the warm amber light of the shop. She looked at Jack, who was calmly taking another sip of his drink. "Jack," she whispered, "you could have been killed. They would have tore you apart." Jack looked at her and shrugged. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few credits, placing them in the tip jar. "They were bullies, Laura. Bullies are not predators. They are scavengers. They look for fear, and when they don't find it, they get confused. Besides, I couldn't let them interrupt our conversation." Laura stared at him. He had faced down 3 armed killers because he didn't want them to interrupt their morning ritual. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but this time it wasn't from adrenaline or rage. It was something else. It was the feeling of being protected. For her entire life she had been the weapon, the shield, the strong one. No one had ever stood in front of her before. "You lied to them," she said softly. "You don't know the port inspector." Jack winked, and the gesture was so charmingly human it made her toes curl. "I am a writer, Laura. I lie for a living. I just usually write it down first." He picked up his notebook and tapped it against the counter. "But you were ready to do something, weren't you? I saw your hands." Laura froze. She looked down at her hands, which were resting on the counter. They were human hands again, but the memory of the claws was still there. She looked back at Jack, terrified of what she would see in his eyes. Disgust. Fear. But Jack only looked curious. He looked at her hands and then up to her face with a softness that broke her heart. You held back. That takes more strength than fighting. I admire that." He didn't know what she was. He thought she was just a girl with a temper. The relief was so profound she almost cried. I just want to do my job," she mumbled. "And you do it well," Jack said. He finished his coffee and set the mug down. "But you are still shaking." "I am fine," she lied. Jack shook his head. "No, you are not. The adrenaline is still in your system. You need to walk it off. What time does your shift end?" Laura glanced at the clock on the wall. "In 10 minutes. Jack nodded. "Good, I will wait. There is a park about 4 levels down near the reservoir. It is quiet there. No machines, no Krell, just trees and water. I will walk you there. You need to decompress." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact delivered in that voice that bypassed all her defenses. A park, quiet, with him. The idea was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. "You don't have to do that," she said, feeling the need to offer him an escape. "I know I don't have to," Jack said. He turned and walked over to a small table in the corner, sitting down and opening his notebook again. "I want to. Now go clean the espresso machine. I have a scene to finish writing before we go." Laura watched him for a moment longer. She watched the way his hand moved across the page, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of coffee and old paper. The monster inside her curled up tight, lulled into submission by the presence of a man who had no claws, no fangs, and no armor, but who had just saved her life without throwing a single punch. She turned back to the machine, her tail swaying gently behind her. She would go for a walk with him. She would listen to his voice. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be alone in the dark anymore. The world outside was loud and dangerous, but in here, with the steam rising and the scratch of his pen on paper, there was a frequency of solace she had never known existed. Jack paused in his writing and looked up, catching her eye one last time before he returned to his work. A small smile played on his lips. It was the smile of a man who had found a story worth telling, and Laura had a sinking feeling that the story was going to be about her. And she found that she didn't mind at all. As the minutes ticked by, Laura cleaned the counter with a mechanical efficiency, her mind entirely elsewhere. She replayed the confrontation in her head, the way he stood, the way he spoke. Most men looked at her and saw a waitress or an exotic alien to be ogled. Some saw the fluffiness of her ears and assumed she was soft. Others saw the sharpness of her eyes and assumed she was trouble. Jack saw none of that. He saw a person who needed quiet. He saw a person who needed protecting, even if he didn't know exactly what he was protecting her from. She finished wiping down the steam wand and untied her apron. She folded it neatly and placed it under the counter. Her replacement, a young avian girl named Kiri, fluttered in from the back room, chirping a cheerful greeting. Laura nodded to her, but didn't speak, afraid that her voice would betray the trembling that was still subsiding in her limbs. She signaled that she was clocking out, and Kiri took over the station, immediately engrossed in the holographic orders. Laura stepped out from behind the counter. She felt exposed without the barrier of the machine between them. She smoothed down her simple gray dress, trying to look like a normal citizen of the district and not a fugitive princess of the lycanthrope high pack. She walked over to Jack's table. He sensed her approach before she arrived. He didn't jump or startle. He simply finished the sentence he was writing, placed the cap on his pen, and closed the book. He stood up, and she realized again that while he wasn't a giant, he had a presence that filled the space. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," Laura replied. They walked out of the brew hub together into the neon-lit twilight of the street. The air was cooler here outside the climate-controlled shop. The hum of the city was a physical weight, a constant thrumming vibration of engines and electricity. Laura's ears twitched, pivoting toward the distant sound of a siren. She flinched slightly. Jack noticed. He moved closer to her, not touching her, but placing himself between her and the noise of the traffic. He began to speak, not about the weather or the incident, but about the history of the architecture they were passing. He talked about how the buildings were designed to mimic the cliff dwellings of old Earth, how the light refractors were tuned to a frequency that encouraged plant growth. His voice was a shield. As long as he was talking, the rest of the world faded into the background. The harsh mechanical grinding of the city was smoothed over by the cadence of his words. Laura found herself matching her stride to his. They walked past the bustling markets, past the hoverdocks, and towards the lift that would take them down to the reservoir levels. She didn't know where this was going. She knew that eventually he would find out what she was. He would see the beast. He would learn why she was hiding. But for now, as they stepped into the lift and the doors slid shut, enclosing them in a quiet box, she let herself believe that maybe the writer could rewrite her ending. "Tell me more," she said, softly breaking the silence as the lift began its descent. "Tell me about the cliff dwellings." Jack smiled, and the sound of his voice filled the small space, vibrating in her chest like a second heartbeat. "Well," he began, "it started with a need for protection, but it ended up becoming a way to be closer to the sky." Laura closed her eyes and listened, letting the story carry her down into the dark safely. The lift doors slid open with a heavy pneumatic hiss that sounded like a dying breath, revealing the reservoir district of Ethelgard. If the upper levels of the city were a monument to chrome and commerce, this subterranean layer was a shrine to neglect and nature claiming back its territory. The air here was heavy with moisture, a dense fog that smelled of wet concrete and moss clinging to the synthesized stone walls. It was a place where the artificial light was dim and tinted a sickly green, mimicking the depths of an ancient forest canopy. To most citizens of the station, this was merely the plumbing, the ugly infrastructure that kept the glittering towers above hydrated. To Laura, it was the closest thing to home she had found in 3 years of running. They stepped out onto the metal grating of the walkway, which hovered 10 feet above the dark, sluggish water of the reclamation pools. The sound of the city was muffled here, replaced by the rhythmic dripping of condensation and the low thrum of the filtration turbines deep below the surface. Jack walked with his hands in the pockets of his worn leather jacket, his eyes scanning the shadows not with fear, but with the same analytical curiosity he had shown in the cafe. He did not seem bothered by the dampness or the gloom. In fact, he seemed to fit right in, a man of textures and rough edges, walking through a world that had forgotten how to be polished. Laura stayed close to him, her senses expanding into the dark. Down here the noise was different. It was biological. She could hear the scuttling of vermin in the pipes, the splash of bottom feeders in the water, and the distant echo of maintenance drones. But mostly she heard Jack. She heard the steady rhythm of his heart, which was beating at a slow, calm 55 beats per minute. It was a metronome that kept her own racing pulse in check. She watched him stop by a railing, looking out over the expanse of dark water, where bioluminescent algae swirled in lazy patterns. "It is peaceful down here," Jack said, his voice rolling through the fog like distant thunder. "Most people are afraid of the dark because they cannot see what is inside it. They forget that the dark is also a blanket. It hides you. It keeps you warm if you let it." Laura gripped the railing, her knuckles white. Her claws threatened to puncture the metal coating. She looked at him, her large, warm eyes filled with a mixture of longing and terror. She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to tell him that she was not afraid of the dark because she was the dark. She was the thing that people feared would jump out from the shadows. But she couldn't. If he knew what she really was, a Valdris royal, an apex predator bred for war, he would look at her with the same revulsion everyone else did. He would see a monster. "I am not sure I deserve to be hidden," Laura whispered, the confession tearing itself from her throat before she could stop it. "I think sometimes that the light exposes us for a reason, to show everyone the cracks." Jack turned his head slowly to look at her. In the dim green light, his face was a landscape of shadows and sharp angles. He did not look surprised by her self-loathing. He looked as if he had read it in a book 1,000 times and knew exactly which page she was stuck on. "Cracks are not defects, Laura," he said softly, moving a step closer. "Cracks are how the pressure escapes. If you didn't have cracks, you would explode. You are holding so much inside of you. I can feel it vibrating off you like heat from an engine. You think you are broken because you don't fit into the mold that this plastic city has built for you. But maybe the mold is the problem. Maybe you are just too much reality for a world that prefers simulations. Laura felt a tear track hot and fast down her cheek, getting lost in the fur near her jawline. He was doing it again. He was rewriting her internal narrative, turning her shame into a virtue with nothing but words. She wanted to lean into him, to bury her face in the rough fabric of his jacket and smell the coffee and old paper that clung to him. But before she could move, her ears swiveled sharply to the left. A sound. It was not the drip of water or the hum of a turbine. It was the soft, wet scrape of claws on metal. It was a sound she knew better than her own name. It was the sound of a hunter stalking prey. The air in the reservoir seemed to drop 10 degrees instantly. The scent hit her a second later, a pungent musk of wet fur, stale blood, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. It was the smell of the Void Pack. They had found her. Laura shoved Jack behind her, her movement a blur of speed that no human eye could track. She dropped into a crouch, her legs coiled like high-tension springs. A low growl started deep in her chest, a vibration that rattled her ribs. Her eyes, which had been soft and brown, dilated until they were pools of black gold, scanning the fog for movement. "Stay back," she hissed, her voice distorted by the changing shape of her vocal cords. "Jack, do not move. Do not speak." Jack did not run. He did not scream. He simply took a half step back to give her space, his notebook appearing in his hand as if by magic. He stood there witnessing her transformation, not with horror but with a sudden, intense focus. From the shadows of a large drainage pipe, a figure emerged. It was a male of her species, but twisted. He was a scout, a lower caste wolf bred for tracking and cruelty. His fur was matted and gray, his body lean and wiry, covered in the scars of 1,000 dominance fights. He wore the leather and steel harness of the Void Pack. The sigil of the broken moon burned into the shoulder pad. His yellow eyes locked onto Laura, and a grin spread across his muzzle, revealing teeth that had been filed to needle points. "Princess," the scout snarled, his voice a high, rasping bark. "You are a hard female to track. The Alpha has been very unhappy. He has broken 3 furniture sets waiting for you." Laura bared her fangs, her hands fully transformed, now tipped with obsidian claws that could shear through body armor. "Go back, Goran. Tell him I am dead. Tell him I fell into the waste processing. If you try to take me, I will paint this walkway with your insides." Goran laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "You have grown soft, princess. Look at you, wearing a dress, serving bean water to cattle. You smell like milk and submission. You are no match for a warrior of the Void. Come quietly and maybe I will let you keep your ears." Goran took a step forward, his own claws extending. He was fast. Laura knew he was fast. She had been living on caffeine and anxiety for 3 years while he had been training and killing. She braced herself, calculating the angle of his lunge, preparing to sacrifice her left arm to protect her throat. Then Jack stepped forward. He walked past Laura, moving with that same maddeningly slow gait. He stepped directly into the space between the 2 predators. He did not look at Laura. He looked straight at Goran. He did not raise his hands. He did not puff out his chest. He stood with his weight on his back foot, his posture relaxed, his notebook held loosely at his side. "Excuse me," Jack said. The silence that followed was absolute. Goran stopped mid-step, his brain short-circuiting. He had expected the human to run. He had expected the human to cower. He had not expected the human to interrupt a blood feud with the tone of a librarian asking for quiet. "Who are you?" Meet Goran snarled, confused. "Get out of the way, or I will eat your liver as an appetizer." Jack sighed, a long, weary exhalation that suggested he found the threat incredibly derivative. "You are standing on a Class 4 structural suspension bridge," Jack said, pointing his pen at the grating beneath Goran's feet. "This section of the reservoir was built 70 years ago by the lowest bidder. The resonant frequency of this metal is extremely unstable." If you lunge at her, the sheer kinetic force of your weight combined with the impact will likely cause a harmonic tremor that will shear the bolts holding this walkway to the wall. Goran blinked. He looked down at the floor, then back at Jack. "You are lying." "Am I?" Jack asked. He tapped his pen against the railing. Tink, tink, tink. The sound rang out clear and sharp, echoing in the damp air. "Hear that echo? That is the sound of metal fatigue. You are a big fellow, maybe 300 pounds, plus armor. You are already pushing the weight limit. If you engage in combat here, you will both fall 200 feet into the filtration tanks. The bacteria in those tanks are designed to dissolve organic matter in seconds. It is a very unpleasant way to die." Laura stared at the back of Jack's head. She knew for a fact that this walkway was reinforced with carbon nanotubes and could hold a tank. He was lying through his teeth, but he was lying with such conviction, with such absolute scientific authority, that doubt began to creep into the scout's eyes. Wolves understood strength. They understood physics. They did not understand structural engineering. Goran hesitated. He shifted his weight, testing the floor. It creaked. Jack nodded solemnly. "See, you are already stressing the integrity. Now I am a writer. I observe things. I noticed the rust on the support beams when we walked out here. You probably missed it because you were too busy smelling the air. But I suggest that if you want to survive the next 5 minutes, you turn around and walk. Do not run back into that pipe." "You are protecting her," the scout growled, but his voice had lost its edge. He was looking at the floor now, terrified that the ground was about to swallow him. A human protecting a royal. That is against the natural law. Jack took a step closer to the wolf. He was now within striking distance. One swipe and Jack would be headless, but Jack leaned in, his eyes hard and cold like flint. "I am not protecting her," Jack said, his voice dropping to that register that vibrated in Laura's bones. "I am managing a volatile situation. She is a barista who makes excellent coffee. You are a trespasser who smells like wet dog and bad decisions. I have a deadline to meet and I cannot concentrate with you snarling. So here is the deal. You leave. You tell your alpha you lost the trail, or you attack. The bridge collapses. We all die. And I promise you my ghost will haunt you for being stupid enough to ignore the laws of physics." The two males stared at each other. One was a biological killing machine, a towering mass of muscle and hate. The other was a man in a worn jacket with a pen. It was a battle of will. Goran was used to fear. He fed on it, but there was no fear in Jack. There was only a bored certainty, and that terrified the wolf. A creature that did not fear death must know something he didn't. Goran snarled a low, frustrated sound. He looked at Laura, who was still crouched ready to spring. "This isn't over, princess. The alpha will come himself. He will be disappointed with the architecture too," Jack noted dryly. Goran spat on the grating, glared at Jack one last time, and then turned slowly, backing away with careful, deliberate steps. He did not run until he reached the safety of the drainage pipe. Then, with a final howl of frustration, he disappeared into the darkness. Laura stayed in her crouch for a long time, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited for the bridge to collapse. She waited for Jack to scream. She waited for him to run away from the monster he had just seen. But the bridge held, and Jack did not run. He turned to her, his movements slow and unthreatening. He capped his pen. He put the notebook in his pocket. Then he knelt down in front of her. He did not touch her. He just knelt so he was at eye level with her snarling, terrified face. "You can come back now, Laura," he said softly. "He is gone." Laura trembled. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her weak and nauseous. She looked at her hands, which were still claws. She looked at Jack's face, searching for the rejection. "You saw," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You saw what I am." "I saw a woman defending herself," Jack corrected. "I saw a reflex. Biology is not a sin, Laura. It is just hardware." "He is going to come back," she sobbed, the wolf receding as the human tears took over. "They will all come back. I am dangerous, Jack. I am a killer. You shouldn't be near me. You should have run. Why didn't you run?" Jack reached out and for the first time he touched her. He placed his hand on her shoulder. His grip was warm and firm. It was not the grip of a man holding a monster. It was the grip of a man holding a friend. "Because I checked the schematics of this walkway on the lift ride down," Jack said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It is rated for 5 tons. I knew it wouldn't break." Laura blinked, the absurdity of the statement cutting through her panic. You lied to him. You bluffed a scout of the Void Pack with structural engineering jargon." Jack shrugged. "The mind is a weapon too, Laura. Sometimes it is sharper than a claw. He was big and he was strong, but he was stupid. He let me define the reality of the situation. Once I controlled the reality, I controlled him." He stood up and offered her his hand. His palm was open, inviting. "Come on," he said. "The fog is getting thicker, and I think we both need a drink that isn't coffee. My apartment is 6 blocks from here. It is small and it is messy, but it has a very sturdy lock, and the walls are lined with books, which makes it excellent for soundproofing." Laura looked at his hand. It was a human hand. Fragile, pale, no claws, but it was the strongest thing she had ever seen. She felt a shift inside her, a realignment of her world. All her life she had been taught that strength was violence, that power was the ability to inflict pain. But here was a man who had defeated a warrior with a sentence. Here was a man who looked at her beast and saw only a woman who was tired. She reached out. Her hand was shaking, but as her fingers touched his, the transformation finally released its hold. Her claws receded. Her fur smoothed back. Her hand became a human hand again, small and pale against his. He pulled her up. She stumbled slightly, and he caught her, steadying her with an arm around her waist. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him, letting his gravity hold her upright. "You aren't afraid of me?" she asked, one last time needing to hear it. Jack looked down at her, his eyes serious. "Laura, I am a writer. I spend my life making up monsters in my head. Real life is rarely as scary as what I can imagine. You are not a monster. You are just a girl with a very loud family, and I am very good at handling noise." They walked back to the lift in silence, but it was not the heavy silence of before. It was a companionable silence. The scout was gone, but the threat remained. Laura knew that Goran was right. The Alpha would come. But for the first time since she had fled the Valdris system, she didn't feel like prey. She looked at the man walking beside her, the man with the notebook and the worn jacket, and she realized that she had found something more dangerous than a wolf. She had found a tactician. And for the first time, she pitied the Alpha who would try to take her from him. As the lift doors closed, shutting out the green gloom of the reservoir, Laura realized she was still holding Jack's hand. He didn't let go. He simply squeezed her fingers gently, a silent promise that he was there, that he was real, and that he wasn't going anywhere. The hum of the lift rising felt different now. It didn't feel like an escape. It felt like an ascension. "We should order pizza," Jack mused aloud, staring at the floor indicator numbers as they climbed. "I know a place that uses real cheese. Synthetic cheese is an abomination against sentience." Laura let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Real cheese sounds good," she said. "And oat milk," Jack added, "for the coffee in the morning." Laura looked at him, her heart swelling until it felt too big for her chest. "You are assuming I am staying for the morning." Jack looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes stole the breath from her lungs. "I am assuming nothing, Laura, but I am hopping. Stories are always better when the characters stick together." The lift chimed, signaling their arrival at the residential level. The doors opened to a hallway that smelled of floor polish and ozone. It was mundane. It was boring. It was perfect. They stepped out together, two mismatched souls bound by a shared secret and a bluff that had saved their lives, ready to face whatever chapter came next. The lock on Jack's apartment door engaged with a heavy mechanical clunk that sounded like the final period at the end of a very long and chaotic sentence. It was a physical bolt made of hardened steel, installed by a previous tenant who clearly shared Jack's distrust of digital security systems, which could be hacked by anyone with a decryption algorithm, and 5 minutes of spare time. Inside, the air was stagnant and smelled of dust and vanilla, and the sharp, acrid scent of old paper that was slowly decomposing. To Laura's heightened senses, it was an olfactory explosion of history. The apartment was not so much a living space as it was a library that had been invaded by a bed and a kitchenette. Stacks of books lined every wall, floor to ceiling, creating a labyrinth of literature that muffled the sounds of the outside world. There were no windows here, only a skylight that had been painted over with black sealant to keep out the perpetual neon glare of the Ethelgard skyline. Jack moved through the clutter with the practiced ease of a man who had memorized the topography of his own mess, stepping over a stack of encyclopedias and tossing his keys into a ceramic bowl that rang out with a clear bell-like tone. He did not turn on the main lights, which would have been harsh and buzzing, but instead flicked on a small brass desk lamp that cast a warm amber glow over the room. He turned to Laura, who was still standing by the door, her back pressed against the metal, as if she expected the Krell mercenaries or the Void Scout to burst through it at any moment. Her skin was pale underneath the soft fur of her ears, and her eyes were darting around the room, tracking the flight of a dust mote with a terrifying intensity. The adrenaline that had sustained her in the reservoir was crashing, and in its wake it was leaving something far more dangerous. "You can sit anywhere," Jack said, gesturing vaguely at a leather armchair that was currently occupied by a pile of research notes. "Just move the papers to the floor. They are drafts of Chapter 4. It was a terrible chapter anyway. The protagonist spent too much time thinking and not enough time doing. I need to rewrite it." Laura tried to nod, but the movement sent a spike of nausea rolling through her gut. The silence of the apartment was not actually silent to her. Now that the immediate threat of violence was gone, her auditory filters were collapsing. She could hear the electricity coursing through the wires in the walls, a high-pitched singing that felt like a needle being driven into her eardrum. She could hear the drip of a faucet in the kitchenette counting down seconds like a bomb. She could hear the heartbeat of a neighbor 3 floors up. It was the lunar fever. It was a condition specific to her bloodline, a sensory overload that occurred when the stress of suppressing the wolf clashed with the biological imperative to let it loose. Usually she took suppressants. Her suppressants were in her locker at the brew hub. She was miles away from them. "I need," quiet Laura gasped, her hands flying up to cover her sensitive ears. "It is too loud. Jack, it is all too loud." Jack stopped halfway to the kitchen, where he had been reaching for the kettle. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her with that analytical gaze that missed nothing. He saw the way her pupils were oscillating, the way her claws were fighting to emerge again, the sheen of sweat on her forehead. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't say the room was quiet. He understood immediately that her reality was different from his. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, but he stopped a few feet away, respecting her space. He crouched down so he was looking up at her, reducing his threat profile. "Tell me what you hear, Laura," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "Focus on my voice. Ignore the rest. What do you hear?" "I hear the wires," she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. "I hear the water. I hear the building settling. It hurts. It feels like my head is going to split open. The wolf wants to tear the walls down to stop the noise." Jack nodded slowly. "Sensory gating failure. Your brain is processing every signal as a priority threat. We need to dampen the input." He stood up and moved with a purpose that was calm but urgent. He went to the bookshelf nearest the bed and began pulling down thick, heavy volumes. They were old legal texts bound in dense leather. He didn't explain what he was doing, he just worked. He cleared a space in the corner of the room between the bed and the wall, a small alcove that was sheltered on 3 sides by books. He grabbed the duvet from his bed, a heavy weighted blanket filled with synthetic sand, and draped it over the gap, creating a dark, insulated cave. "Get in there," Jack ordered gently. "It is a makeshift isolation chamber. The density of the books combined with the weighted blanket will absorb about 60% of the ambient vibration. It is not perfect, but it is better than standing in the open. Laura looked at the dark little fort he had built. It looked ridiculous. It looked like something a child would build. But the moment she crawled inside, the relief was instant and staggering. The heavy blanket cut off the amber light, plunging her into a soothing darkness. The walls of books absorbed the high-pitched singing of the electricity. The world shrank down to a space 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. She curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her tail around herself like a scarf. She was shaking violently, her body burning with fever, but the noise, the terrible, agonizing noise, had dulled to a manageable roar. Jack did not leave. He did not go to the kitchen. He sat down on the floor right outside the entrance to her fortress. She could sense him there. She could smell the ink and the coffee. She could hear his heart beating steady and slow, a rhythmic thumping that was louder than the distant chaos of the city. "I am right here, Laura," Jack said, his voice coming through the blanket, muffled and soft. "I am going to sit here and I am going to guard the door. No one is coming in. The scout is gone. The Krell are gone. It is just us and the books." Laura let out a whimper that was half human and half animal. The fever was burning through her veins, turning her blood to lava. Her mind was fracturing. Flashes of her past assaulted her. The cold steel of the nursery on Valdris, the harsh lessons of the pack, the blood on her hands, the first time she had been forced to kill. She felt like a monster. She felt like a disease that was going to infect this safe, quiet place. "You should leave," she cried out, her voice cracking. "Jack, please, I might hurt you. When the fever peaks, I don't know who I am. I might strike out. I am a predator. You can't tame this." Jack's laughter was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Tame it? Laura, I'm not trying to tame you. I'm trying to keep you company, and you won't hurt me. You have had a dozen chances to hurt me today, and every time you chose to protect me instead. Even when your instincts were screaming at you to kill, you stood in front of me. That is who you are. The fever doesn't change your soul, it just tests your hardware." He shifted, shuffling closer, until his back was resting against the stack of books that formed the wall of her shelter. "I am going to read to you," he announced. "No," Laura moaned, writhing in the small space. "No more noise, please." "Not noise," Jack corrected. "Signal. You are drowning in static, Laura. You need a strong, clear signal to lock onto. If you focus on the signal, the static fades away. It is a basic principle of acoustics. My voice is going to be your anchor. You focus on the vibration of my words and you let everything else slide off." He didn't wait for her permission. He opened the notebook he had carried with him all day, the one with the peeling cover and the coffee stains. He cleared his throat, a sound that was surprisingly gentle, and began to read. The city of Ormer was not built, it was grown. It rose from the silicate sands of the desert like a crystallized idea, distinct and sharp against the chaotic horizon. To the traveler coming in from the wastes, it looked like a mirage, a promise of water and shade that would surely vanish if one dared to reach out and touch it. But Alara knew better. Alara knew that the walls were hard and the water was cold and the shade cost more credits than she would ever earn in a lifetime. Jack's voice was a physical force. It was not loud, but it was resonant. He spoke with a cadence that was hypnotic, a rhythmic rise and fall that mimicked the ocean or the wind. He didn't read like he was reciting text. He read like he was weaving a spell. He enunciated every consonant, gave weight to every vowel. Inside the blanket fort, Laura stopped writhing. She couldn't help it. Her ears, which were twitching in agony at the random sounds of the building, locked onto the pattern of his speech. It was predictable. It was structured. It was safe. The vibrations of his chest traveled through the floor and into her body, countering the erratic trembling of her limbs. She focused on the story. She visualized the crystal city he was describing. She saw Alara, the protagonist, walking through the streets. Alara was not like the others. Jack read on, turning the page, the sound of the paper crinkling loud but bearable. She carried a fire in her blood that the cold logic of the city could not extinguish. They called her a defect. They called her a glitch. But as she looked at the binary sunset, watching the twin stars dip below the horizon, she wondered if perhaps the machine was the defect, and she was the only living thing left inside it. Laura's breathing hitched. He was writing about her. Or maybe he was writing about himself. Or maybe he was writing about everyone who had ever felt out of place in a universe designed for conformity. The fever was still there, burning hot and fierce, but it was no longer consuming her. It was receding into the background, pushed back by the sheer weight of Jack's narrative. He was building a world with his voice and inviting her to live in it, a world where she was the hero, not the monster. Jack read for hours. He read until his voice grew raspy and deep, scratching at the edges of his range. He read through the first 3 chapters of his manuscript. He read through his notes. When he ran out of fiction, he started reading from the encyclopedia of ancient Earth history that was sitting on the floor next to him. He read about the migration patterns of whales. He read about the construction of the pyramids. It didn't matter what the words were. It only mattered that he kept speaking, that he kept the signal strong. Laura drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point she had uncurled from her ball. She had pushed the blanket aside just a fraction so she could see him. He was sitting there in the amber light, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that were not muscular like a warrior's but wiry and capable. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, but he didn't stop. He took a sip of lukewarm water from a bottle and continued to read about the atmospheric composition of Venus. "Jack," she whispered. Her voice was weak, but the edge of panic was gone. He stopped mid-sentence. He looked down at her, peering into the gap in the blankets. "Hey, you are back." "I am back," she said. "The fire is gone. It is just embers now." "Good," Jack said, closing the book gently. He shifted his legs, stretching out muscles that must have been screaming in protest after sitting on the hard floor for so long. "You didn't stop," Laura said, reaching a hand out from the darkness. Her fingers brushed against his knee. "You stayed." "I told you," Jack said, covering her hand with his. "I have a deadline, and I needed an audience. Writing is a lonely business, Laura. It is just me and the voices in my head. It was nice to have someone listen for a change." "You saved me," Laura said, and she meant it literally. If he hadn't anchored her, she would have shifted. She would have torn the apartment apart. She would have brought the authorities down on them. "We saved each other," Jack countered. "Do you know how hard it is to get a critique partner in this district? Most people just want to watch the holovids. You actually listened. I saw your ears moving. You liked the part about the Crystal City, didn't you?" Laura smiled, a weak, exhausted expression that showed her sharp teeth but held no aggression. "I liked the part where she realized she wasn't a glitch." Jack squeezed her hand. "That is the most important part." He moved the blanket fully aside. The room was still dim, but the oppressive terror was gone. Laura crawled out of her cave. She was stiff and her dress was rumpled, and she knew she probably smelled like fever sweat and ozone. No, not ozone, she smelled like stress. She slumped against the side of the bed, too tired to stand. Jack stood up, groaning as his joints popped. "I'm going to make tea, real tea, not the synthesized powder, chamomile. It is supposed to help with the nerves, and then we are going to sleep. You can take the bed, I will take the chair." Laura shook her head. "No, I can't take your bed." "Laura," Jack said, holding up a hand to stop her protest. "You are a royal lycanthrope recovering from a biological crisis. I am a human writer with a caffeine addiction. I can sleep standing up if I have to. You take the bed. That is a non-negotiable narrative directive." He went to the kitchenette, and she watched him work. The domesticity of the scene was so jarringly at odds with her life that it made her chest ache. She was used to barracks, used to hiding holes, used to running. She was not used to a man boiling water for her and insisting she take the softest sleeping spot. When he came back with the mug, she was sitting on the edge of the bed. She took the tea, her hands steady now. "Jack," she asked, looking into the dark, swirling liquid, "why aren't you afraid?" Jack sat down in the armchair, pulling his legs up and resting his chin on his knees. He looked at her over the rim of his own mug. "I think," Jack said slowly, measuring his words, "I think fear is a reaction to the unknown. When I look at you, I don't see an unknown. I see a biology that is different from mine but follows its own logic. I see a history that is painful, and I see a person who is trying very hard to be good in a world that makes it easy to be bad. That is not scary, Laura. That is familiar. He took a sip of tea. Besides, I have always preferred dogs to cats. They are more loyal. Laura let out a startled laugh that turned into a snort. She covered her mouth, mortified. Jack grinned. There it is. The first honest laugh of the evening. We are making progress. He set his mug down and leaned back, closing his eyes. Go to sleep, Laura. The door is locked. The books are thick, and I am a light sleeper. If the bad dreams come, I will read to you about the mating habits of the North American beaver until you are so bored you pass out again. Laura lay down, pulling the duvet up to her chin. The sheets smelled like him. It was a comforting scent, earthy and real. She watched him for a long time until his breathing evened out and his head lolled to the side in sleep. She realized then that the free drinks at the cafe had been the best investment she had ever made. She had thought she was just being kind to a lonely customer. She hadn't realized she was buying a sanctuary. For the first time in 3 years, Laura closed her eyes and didn't check the exits. She just listened to the steady rhythm of Jack's breathing and let herself drift into a dreamless sleep, guarded by a wall of books and a man who fought monsters with metaphors. But deep in her subconscious, the wolf was not sleeping. It was watching. It was watching Jack with a fierce, possessive intensity. He had protected the pack. He had provided the den. He had soothed the fever. The wolf did not know what a rider was, but it knew what an alpha was. And as far as the beast inside her was concerned, the man in the worn jacket had just claimed the title, not by shedding blood but by spilling ink. And if the void pack came back, and they would come back, they would find that the human was not unguarded. They would find that he had a shadow with teeth, and she would rip the throat out of anyone who dared to interrupt his story again. The night deepened over the Earth District. Outside, the neon lights flickered and the sirens wailed, but inside the apartment there was only the quiet resonance of two breathing in unison, a fragile peace built on words and trust, and the lingering scent of chamomile tea. It was the calm before the storm, but for tonight it was enough. The morning light that filtered through the blackened skylight of Jack's apartment was not the harsh neon glare of the Ethelgard streets, but a diffused gray softness that signaled the start of a rotation cycle that would change everything. Laura woke before Jack did, because her biology did not allow for the luxury of grogginess. Her eyes snapped open, and her ears swiveled instantly to the rhythm of his breathing, which was a steady, slow draft of air that sounded like the tide rolling in over a calm beach. She lay there for a long moment beneath the heavy duvet that smelled of him, a scent of cedar shavings and old ink, and she marveled at the fact that she was still alive. The lunar fever had broken in the night, leaving her limbs heavy and her mind clear, but the memory of his voice reading about ancient cities and biological anomalies was imprinted on her cortex like a brand. She turned her head on the pillow to look at him. He was asleep in the armchair, his head lolled back at an uncomfortable angle, his mouth slightly open, and a book about contract law resting precariously on his chest. He looked fragile. He looked like something that would be crushed in the first 5 seconds of a pack dominance fight. Yet she knew with a terrifying certainty that he was the most dangerous thing in the room. Jack woke not with a start, but with a sudden transition to alertness, as if his brain had simply booted up its operating system. He opened his eyes, blinked once at the ceiling, and then looked directly at her. There was no confusion in his gaze, no momentary lapse where he had to remember who she was or why there was a werewolf in his bed. He simply smiled, that slow, crinkling smile that made the knot of anxiety in her stomach loosen just a fraction. "Good morning, Laura," he said, his voice rough with sleep, a gravelly texture that sent a fresh wave of shivers down her spine. "I trust the fever has subsided. You stopped vibrating around 300 hours, so I assumed it was safe to stop reading about the industrial output of the Martian colonies." "It has passed," Laura said, sitting up and pulling the duvet around her shoulders. She felt exposed, not physically but spiritually. He had seen her at her weakest, and he had not flinched. "Thank you, Jack. You kept the noise away." Jack stretched his arms above his head, his joints popping with a series of sharp cracks that sounded like pistol shots in the quiet room. He stood up and walked to the kitchenette, filling the kettle again. He moved with a deliberate slowness, a refusal to rush that Laura was beginning to realize was his primary weapon against a galaxy that demanded speed. "We have work to do," he said over his shoulder. "The coffee shop opens in an hour, and unless my understanding of narrative structure is completely flawed, your alpha is going to be there." The scout ran away, which means he went to fetch the big gun. A plot point like that always escalates. It is the rule of rising action. Laura froze her hands, gripping the duvet until the fabric strained. "We can't go back there, Jack. Malachar isn't like the scout. He isn't just a bully. He is a warlord. He conquered the Stellar Rim Pax by tearing the throat out of the previous alpha with his teeth. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't care about structural engineering or building codes. If we go back there, he will kill you." Jack watched the water boil, his expression mild. "He will try to intimidate me, certainly. He will threaten violence, but he won't kill me, not if we control the setting. See, Laura, men like Malachar rely on a very specific script. They rely on fear. They rely on the other person running or fighting back physically. If you run, he chases. If you fight, he overpowers you. But if you do neither, if you change the genre of the story from an action movie to a courtroom drama, he won't know his lines." He turned around and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Besides, I need my morning coffee. And I am not going to let an overgrown canine with an anger management problem dictate where I get my caffeine." Laura looked at him, and for the first time she saw past the worn jacket and the writer's slouch. She saw the steel spine of a man who refused to be moved. It wasn't bravery in the traditional sense. It was an arrogance so profound it circled back around to genius. He believed so thoroughly in the power of his own mind that he rendered physical threats irrelevant. "You are insane," she whispered. "I am a writer," Jack corrected. "Same thing. Now get dressed. We are going to the brew hub, and you are going to make me a cappuccino, a real one." The walk back to the Earth District brew hub felt to Laura like a funeral procession. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every passerby looked like an enemy. But Jack walked with his hands in his pockets, whistling a tune that sounded vaguely like an old Earth jazz standard. He stopped to look at a holographic advertisement for a new shuttle service. He commented on the font choice. He was aggressively normal, and as they walked, Laura found herself falling into step with him, matching his rhythm. His calm was contagious. It was a field of gravity that pulled her in and stabilized her orbit. When they rounded the corner to the brew hub, the street was unnervingly empty. The usual morning rush of commuters was gone. The sidewalk was clear, and standing in front of the glass doors of the cafe were 4 members of the Void Pack. They were massive, towering, nearly 7 feet tall in their combat armor, their fur bristling, their yellow eyes scanning the perimeter. But they weren't the main event. Sitting at the outdoor table, the one Jack usually occupied, was Malachar. He was a monster of a wolf. His fur was jet black, scarred by silver lines where blades and plasma had failed to kill him. He wore no armor, only a simple vest that showed off arms the size of tree trunks. He was drinking from one of the delicate ceramic cups, holding it with a delicacy that was more terrifying than if he had crushed it. When he saw Laura, his ears swiveled forward, and a low, thrumming growl started in his chest, a sound so deep it vibrated the glass windows of the shop. Laura stopped dead, her instincts screaming at her to flee. This was death. This was the end. Jack didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He walked right past the 4 guards who were too stunned by his audacity to grab him and walked straight up to the table. He pulled out the chair opposite Malachar and sat down. He placed his notebook on the table. He took a pen from his pocket. He uncapped it. "You are in my seat," Jack said. The silence that descended on the street was heavy enough to crush a starship. The guards turned to stare. Laura stood paralyzed, 10 feet away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Malachar stared at the human. His eyes were pools of molten gold, burning with a violence that had leveled cities. He set the cup down slowly. "You are the human the scout told me about," Malachar said, his voice a grinding tectonic shift of gravel and rage. "The one who speaks with fancy words. The one who thinks he can keep what is mine." Jack opened his notebook to a fresh page. He didn't look at Malachar. He looked at the paper. "I don't recall seeing a receipt of ownership," Jack said, writing the date in the top corner. "Laura is an employee of this establishment. She is a sentient being under the protection of the Galactic Charter. She is not a piece of luggage you can check at the gate. And you are still in my seat." Malachar stood up. It was like watching a mountain rise. He cast a shadow that swallowed Jack whole. He leaned across the table, his muzzle inches from Jack's face. He smelled of blood and old iron. "I could snap your neck with 2 fingers," Writer Malachar snarled. "I could tear your head off and mount it on my ship. Do you know who I am? I am the Alpha of the Void. I am the Eater of Moons. And you are nothing but soft pink meat." Jack finally looked up. He didn't lean back. He didn't blink. He looked Malachar in the eye with an expression of mild disappointment. "I know exactly who you are," Jack said, his voice dropping to that resonant pitch that cut through the air like a physical force. "You are a cliché. You are the tragic antagonist in the second act who thinks volume equals power. You are a biological dead-end, Malachar. You rule by fear, which means your foundation is cracked. The moment you show weakness, your own pack will eat you. You don't have loyalty. You have terrified hostages. And that makes you weak." Malachar roared a sound that shattered the window of the shop behind them. He raised a massive fist claws, extending ready to bring it down and turn Jack into a memory. Laura screamed, ready to launch herself at the Alpha, to die protecting the man who had protected her. "Sit down," Jack commanded. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He spoke the words with the absolute, unshakable authority of a god commanding the tide to recede. It was the human Alpha voice. The voice of a parent scolding a petulant child, the voice of a judge delivering a verdict. Malachar froze. His fist hovered in the air. His brain, which was wired for combat, for resistance, for the clash of strength against strength, could not process the command. It was not a challenge. It was an order. And for a split second, the ancient programming of the pack, the instinct to obey the one who is most certain, misfired. "I said sit down," Jack repeated, his voice softer now but heavier. "We are not going to fight, Malachar. Fighting is for beasts who cannot articulate their grievances. We are going to talk. You are going to tell me why you think you have a right to her, and I am going to explain to you using small words why you are wrong. This is the Earth District. We don't do blood feuds here. We do litigation. And I assure you my pen is sharper than your claws." Malachar lowered his hand slowly, his face twisting in confusion. He looked at his guards, who were looking back at him, waiting for orders. If he struck now, he would prove the human right, that he was just a beast. If he sat, he acknowledged the human's authority. It was a trap, a brilliant psychological trap. "I will not be lectured by cattle," Malachar spat, but he didn't strike. "Then you forfeit," Jack said calmly, returning to his writing. "By the laws of the First Compact, which your ancestors signed, by the way, a challenge of dominance can be mental as well as physical. You are refusing the debate. That is a submission. You are admitting you aren't smart enough to beat me in a conversation." The insult landed like a physical blow. Malachar's pride was his armor, and Jack had just found the chink. To be called weak was one thing. To be called stupid was unforgivable. "I can outthink you, human," Malachar growled, sitting back down slowly, the chair creaking under his massive weight. "I will break your mind, and then I will break your body." Laura watched in disbelief as the warlord of the Void Pack sat down to debate a writer. She moved slowly toward the table, her legs trembling. "Coffee, Laura," Jack said without looking up. "2 cups, black, and bring a saucer for the Alpha. He is making a mess of the table." Laura hurried into the shop, stepping over the shattered glass. Her hands shook as she worked the machine, but her mind was racing. Jack had done it. He had changed the battlefield. He had turned a massacre into a meeting. She watched them through the broken window. Jack was talking, his hands moving in calm, expressive gestures. Malachar was leaning forward, his brow furrowed, trying to keep up with the torrent of logic and law that Jack was unleashing. She brought the coffee out. She placed a cup in front of Jack and one in front of Malachar. She stood by Jack's side, expecting him to tell her to hide. "Stay here," Jack said, looking up at her and smiling. "I want you to hear this." He turned back to Malachar, who was staring at the coffee as if it were poison. "Here is the reality," Jack said, pointing his pen at the alpha. "You want Laura because she is a royal. You want her genetics to strengthen your line. You think that by forcing her to return you secure your legacy. But you are missing the variable of will. A coerced mate produces weak offspring because the stress hormones poison the womb. That is biological fact. If you take her by force, you destroy the very asset you are trying to acquire. You are a bad investor, Malachar. You are damaging the goods before you even get them home." Malachar snarled, his hands clenching. "She belongs to the pack. It is tradition." "Tradition is just peer pressure from dead people," Jack countered smoothly. "And it is inefficient. Look at her." Jack gestured to Laura, who stood tall beside him, her apron tied over her dress, her ears perked high. "She is thriving here," Jack said. "She is learning patience. She is learning commerce. She is learning how to interact with other species without killing them. These are skills your pack lacks. If you were a true leader, a visionary leader, you wouldn't be dragging her back to the Dark Ages. You would be leaving her here as an ambassador. You would be using her position to build an alliance with the Earth District. You could have free trade agreements. You could have better coffee, but instead you are thinking with your ego." Malachar blinked. The concept of trade had never occurred to him. He only knew conquest. But the way Jack framed it, it sounded like power. It sounded like a different kind of conquest. "Ambassador." Malachar grunted the word, tasting strange in his mouth. "It is a position of honor," Jack said, leaning back and taking a sip of his coffee. "Much more prestigious than breeding mare. If you appoint her ambassador, she remains part of the pack, but she stays here. You get the prestige of having a royal in a diplomatic post. She gets to live her life. And I get to keep my barista. It is a win-win-win. Or you can kill me, destroy this shop, get arrested by the Federation fleet that is currently patrolling this sector, and lose everything." Jack paused, letting the silence stretch. "The choice is yours, Alpha. Are you a savage or are you a statesman?" Malachar looked at Jack. Then he looked at Laura. He looked at the guards who were listening intently. He saw the logic. He saw the trap. But he also saw a way out that let him keep his dignity. Jack wasn't fighting him. Jack was offering him a promotion. Malachar picked up the tiny coffee cup. It looked ridiculous in his massive hand. He took a sip. He grimaced at the bitterness, but he didn't spit it out. "An alliance," Malachar mused. "The Void Pack has never had an alliance with Earth." "Because you keep eating the negotiators," Jack deadpanned. "Stop eating people, and you might find the universe is a very profitable place." Malachar let out a low rumble that might have been a laugh or might have been a growl. He looked at Jack with a begrudging respect. "You have a silver-tongued human. It is a dangerous weapon." "I keep it sharp," Jack said. Laura stood there, her hand resting on the back of Jack's chair, and she felt a shift within her soul. For years, she had believed that strength was defined by who could hit the hardest, who could growl the loudest. She looked at Malachar, the physical embodiment of that philosophy, a creature of muscle and violence. And then she looked at Jack, a man who couldn't lift 100 pounds, but who had just brought a warlord to heel with a cup of coffee and a vocabulary. She realized then that she didn't need a protector in the way she had thought. She didn't need someone to fight her battles. She needed someone who could end the war before it began. She looked at Jack's notebook filled with scribbles and doodles, and she understood that those pages were stronger than any shield. Malachar stood up. The chair scraped against the pavement. "I will consider your proposal human. An ambassadorship, it has merit." "It is the only logical path," Jack said, not rising. Malachar nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. Then he turned to Laura. "You have chosen a strange mate, princess. He is small. He smells like ink, but he does not bleed fear. That is rare. "He is not my mate," Laura stammered, her face flushing red. He is a customer." Malaker laughed, a booming sound that echoed down the street. "The wolf knows the wolf girl. You can wear the apron, but I see how you look at him. You look at him like he is the moon." He turned to his guards. "We leave. We have things to discuss." The Void Pack turned and marched away, their heavy boots thudding in unison. Malaker did not look back. He had been defeated, but Jack had allowed him to leave with his pride intact, and that was the greatest victory of all. Jack let out a long, slow breath and slumped slightly in his chair. His hand, the one holding the pen, was trembling just a little. "That went well," he said, his voice returning to its normal volume. Laura walked around the table and sat in the chair Malaker had vacated. She reached across the table and took Jack's hand, calming the tremor. "You are the craziest human I have ever met," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You challenged the Alpha of the Void to a debate, and you won." Jack looked at her, his eyes warm and crinkled at the corners. "I didn't win, Laura. I just rewrote the scene. I told you I don't like tragedies. I prefer stories where the characters talk it out." He squeezed her hand. "But I was serious about the ambassador thing. You should look into the paperwork. It comes with diplomatic immunity, which means you don't have to pay parking tickets." Laura laughed, a free, unburdened sound that rose up into the morning air. For the first time, the heavy weight of her heritage felt light. She wasn't running anymore. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, sitting across from a writer in a worn jacket, holding his hand and listening to the most beautiful sound in the universe, his voice telling her that everything was going to be all right. And the best part was she believed him, because if Jack said it, it had to be true. He was the author of this moment, and he had written them a happy ending, or at least a very promising next chapter. Jack pulled his hand back gently and opened his notebook again. "Now," he said, tapping the page, "I have a sudden inspiration for a scene involving a diplomatic treaty signed in a coffee shop. Do we have any pastries? I find I write better with a croissant." Laura stood up, wiping her eyes. "I will get you the freshest one we have," she said, "on the house." Jack smiled and began to write. "Always on the house," he murmured as she walked away. And as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the shattered glass and the quiet street, the Earth District Brew Hub opened for business, not as a hiding place, but as an embassy of peace presided over by a wolf girl and the man who had taught her how to speak. The shattered glass of the Brew Hub window lay scattered across the pavement like diamonds dusted with city grit, but to Laura it looked less like wreckage and more like confetti left over from a parade that no one else knew had happened. The massive form of Malaker had vanished into the labyrinth of the Ethelgard streets, taking with him the suffocating weight of 3 years of fear, and leaving behind a silence that felt so light it was almost dizzying. Jack sat at the table amidst the debris, calm as a statue, brushing a stray crumb of croissant from his jacket, while the rest of the district slowly exhaled and remembered how to breathe. The bystanders who had watched the confrontation from the safety of the hoverbus stop were beginning to move again, pretending they had not just witnessed a writer dismantle a warlord with nothing but a fountain pen and a grasp of interstellar law. Laura moved to sweep up the glass, her movements mechanical at first, but slowly gaining a fluidity that she hadn't possessed in years. She wasn't sweeping away the past, she was clearing the stage for the future. Every chink of glass dropping into the dustpan sounded like a chain breaking. She paused and looked at Jack, who was busy scribbling in his notebook again, capturing the dialogue while it was fresh in his mind. He looked up, catching her stare, and the corner of his mouth ticked up in that small, private smile that was just for her. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing with his pen to a shard near her boot. "If we are going to be a diplomatic embassy, we really need to adhere to a higher standard of cleanliness. The Galactic Health Inspector is far more terrifying than your Alpha ever was." Laura laughed, and the sound surprised her. It wasn't the nervous titter she used with customers or the sharp bark of the wolf. It was a deep, resonant sound that came from her belly. She swept up the shard and walked over to the table, pulling out the chair opposite him. She didn't ask if she could sit. She just sat. The dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer just the barista serving the customer, she was the partner debriefing the strategist. "You really think he will do it?" she asked, leaning her chin on her hand, her tail swishing contentedly behind her chair. "You think Malaker will actually file the paperwork for an ambassadorship?" Jack stopped writing and tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Malaker is a creature of ego, Laura. I gave him a title that sounds impressive but requires him to do absolutely nothing except boast that he has influence in the Earth District. He will file the paperwork before the sun sets. In his mind, he won. He thinks he negotiated a treaty. He doesn't realize he just signed a permanent leave of absence for his best warrior. That is the beauty of bureaucracy. It allows everyone to feel important while ensuring that nothing actually changes, except the things that matter." He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "You are free," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and golden. Laura looked down at their joined hands. The contrast was stark, his pale, ink-stained fingers against her tawny skin and the subtle roughness of her retracted claws. For so long she had viewed her biology as a curse, a cage that separated her from the soft, civilized world. Jack held her hand like it was a rare artifact, something precious to be studied and admired. "I don't know how to be free," she admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper that was barely audible over the rising hum of the street traffic. "I have been running for so long. I have been hiding. I don't know who I am if I am not looking over my shoulder." Jack squeezed her hand firmly. "You are Laura. You are the woman who makes the best coffee in the sector. You are the woman who stood between a monster and a writer to protect a story she hadn't even read yet. Freedom isn't about knowing exactly where you are going, it is just the absence of the thing that was chasing you. The rest is just improvisation, and you are very good at improvising." He released her hand and sat back, picking up his coffee cup. "Speaking of improvisation, we need to discuss the economics of this establishment. I have been doing some calculations based on the frequency of my visits and the average market price of the beans you use." Laura stiffened slightly, her ears flattening. She knew this conversation was coming. The free drinks, the uncharged refills, the special blends she ordered specifically for him using her own employee discount. Jack continued, his tone light but his eyes serious. "By my estimate, you have given me approximately 4,000 credits worth of coffee over the last 6 months. That is a significant deficit in your inventory logs. If the owner finds out, you could be in trouble." "He knows," Laura blurted out. "The owner knows I pay for them." Jack paused, the cup halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly. "You pay for them out of your wages." Laura nodded, her face burning. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. It was a stupid lycanthrope instinct, a biological imperative that she had tried to suppress but failed. In her culture, in the raw, wild dominance of the pack, you didn't buy gifts for the one you desired. You provided sustenance. You proved you could provide. It was a courtship ritual as old as her DNA. If you wanted the attention of a mate, you fed them. You gave them the best kill, the warmest pelt, or in this case, the finest roast from the highlands of Kepler 186F. It is a custom," she stammered, picking at a loose thread on the tablecloth. "Among my people, we don't ask for dates, we don't send flowers. Those things are useless, we provide. If you want to show someone they matter, you ensure they have energy. You ensure they are warm. I saw you writing every day. I saw how tired you looked. My instincts just took over. I wanted to fuel you." She risked a glance at him, expecting to see confusion or perhaps mockery. It was a primitive thing, after all, a beastly way of saying "I like you." But Jack wasn't laughing. He was looking at her with an expression of profound tenderness, a look that stripped away all her defenses. "You were keeping me alive," he said softly. "I was trying to help you write," Laura whispered. I liked the way your voice vibrated when you ordered. I liked the way you smelled like old paper and focus. I wanted you to stay, so I gave you the only thing I had to give." Jack closed his notebook. He placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. "Laura, I have spent my life inventing romances on paper. I have written about star-crossed lovers meeting on the event horizon of a black hole. I have written about telepathic soul bonds that span galaxies. But not once in all my years of imagining have I ever written anything as romantic as a woman paying for my coffee every single day just to make sure I had the energy to create." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. He placed it on the table between them. "I knew," he confessed. "I knew you were paying for them. I saw you swipe your personal credit chip one day when you thought I was looking at the menu. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to embarrass you. And because I liked the idea that you were taking care of me. It made me feel safe." He pushed the pouch toward her. "I can't pay you back for the coffee," he said. "That was a gift, and to pay for a gift is an insult. But I can give you something in return, a counteroffer." Laura reached out and took the pouch. It was heavy. She loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. It was a key. It was an old-fashioned physical key made of brass, with a bit of black tape wrapped around the head. It wasn't a digital key card. It was a heavy, archaic object that belonged to a lock that required friction and torque to open. "That is the key to my apartment," Jack said. "The one with the wall of books, the one with the skylight. It is not much. It is messy and it smells like me and the plumbing rattles when the pressure drops, but it is quiet, and it is safe. And if you ever need a place to hide from the noise, or if you just want to hear someone read to you about the mating habits of beavers, the door is open." Laura closed her fingers around the key. The metal was warm from his pocket. It felt like an anchor. It felt like a promise. "You are asking me to move in?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am asking you to edit my drafts," Jack corrected with a wink. "I need a live-in critic, someone who isn't afraid to growl at me when the dialogue gets clunky." And he paused, his bravado slipping for just a second, revealing the lonely man beneath. "And I realized last night that the apartment is too big for one person. It needs more life. It needs more ears." Laura clutched the key to her chest. Her tail thumped against the chair, a rhythmic drumbeat of pure joy. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." "Good," Jack said, settling back into his chair. "That is settled then. Now regarding the coffee." He raised a finger signaling for the server. The young avian girl Kiri, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide, unblinking eyes from the doorway. "Kiri," Jack called out, his voice booming with theatrical authority. "2 fresh cups, please. The ambassador blend. And bring the check." Kiri fluttered over, placing 2 steaming mugs on the table and dropping a digital chit between them. She looked at Laura, then at Jack, then squeaked a nervous congratulations before darting back inside. Jack picked up the chit. He pulled a credit stick from his pocket. Laura started to protest, reaching for her own credits, but Jack stopped her with a look. "No," he said firmly. "The courtship ritual has evolved, Laura. You fed me when I was hungry. You fueled the machine. Now the machine is running and it is my turn. From this day forward I pay for the drinks. That is the new deal. The human alpha provides the caffeine. The lycanthrope ambassador provides the inspiration. Do we have an accord?" Laura looked at him. She saw the stubborn set of his jaw. She saw the pride in his eyes. He wasn't doing this to assert dominance over her. He was doing it to create balance. He was stepping up to meet her halfway. "We have an accord," she said, smiling. Jack tapped his credit stick against the chit, the little light flashing green to confirm the transaction. He sat back looking satisfied. "Now," he said, opening his notebook again to the very last page, "I have one last thing to show you. You asked me once what I was writing. You asked me about the story." He turned the notebook around and slid it across the table toward her. Laura looked down at the page. It was handwritten in Jack's scrawling, frantic script. The ink was fresh. It was the ending of the story he had been working on for months, the one he had read to her in the blanket fort. She began to read. The city of Oromar faded into the distance, its crystal spires no longer a cage but a memory. Alara stood on the deck of the transport ship looking out at the stars. She was no longer running. Beside her stood the scribe, a man who had no sword and no shield but whose words had built a bridge over the abyss. Alara looked at her hands. They were strong. They were the hands of a wolf. She looked at the scribe. He was fragile. He was human. But as they stood there watching the twin suns rise, she realized that he was the only thing in the universe that made her feel human too. She took his hand. He squeezed back, and for the first time in her life, Alara did not listen for the sound of pursuit. She only listened to the sound of his voice telling her that the story was just beginning. Laura read the paragraph twice. Her vision blurred. A single tear escaped, rolling down her cheek and landing on the page, smudging the ink of the word beginning. "It's me," she whispered, looking up at him. "Alara, it's me, the wolf girl. You were writing about me." Jack smiled, a soft, genuine expression that lit up his tired face. "I am a writer, Laura," he said. "I write about what I see. And from the moment I walked into this shop and saw a girl with sad eyes and fluffy ears giving away coffee to a stranger, I knew I had found the only protagonist worth writing about. You were never just the barista. You were always the story." Laura reached across the table and took his hand again. The noise of the city seemed to swell around them. The honking of hovercars, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant whine of the maglev trains. But for the first time it didn't hurt her ears. It just sounded like music. It sounded like life. "So how does it end?" she asked, tapping the notebook. "After the ship leaves, what happens next?" Jack laughed and shook his head. "That is the best part," he said, leaning in close, his voice dropping to that vibration that she loved so much. "I don't know. The outline ends there. The rest of the book, we have to write that together. One day at a time. One cup of coffee at a time." He picked up his mug and raised it in a toast. "To the sequel," he said. Laura picked up her mug. Her hand was steady. Her heart was full. She looked at the man in the worn jacket, the man who had faced down an army for her, the man who had built her a fortress out of books, and she knew with absolute certainty that this was going to be her favorite story. "To the sequel," she echoed. They clinked their mugs together, a soft ceramic chime that rang out like a bell. They drank the coffee, warm and bitter and sweet. And as the morning sun climbed higher over the Earth District, casting long shadows across the table, the writer and the werewolf sat together in the quiet center of a loud world, ready to turn the page and see what happened next. There was no cliffhanger. There was no mystery left to solve. There was only the comfortable certainty of a key in a pocket, a hand in a hand, and a notebook waiting to be filled. And for Laura, that was the only happy ending she would ever need. The camera of the universe seemed to pull back then, widening the shot to show the bustling cafe, the busy street, the gleaming towers of Ethelgard rising into the sky. But even as the view expanded, the focus remained tight on the two figures at the table. They were small in the grand scheme of the galaxy, just two specks of biology on a floating rock in space. But they had found the one thing that made the vastness bearable. They had found the frequency where their souls resonated. Jack picked up his pen. Laura took a bite of his croissant. And the story continued, not on the page, but in the silence between the words, where the truest things are always spoken.